All right. Good evening, everyone. My name is Muriel. I will be your tour guide for the 7:30 walking tour. A couple things before we get started. A couple of the ground rules. I have very few. It's mostly to keep you guys safe and not be a part of my tour. Big thing is please watch where you walk. We do not have even streets or sidewalks. Infrastructure is not something we invest in or believe in this town, and it's also we built in a swamp, so yes, we are absolutely sinking at all times. If you have open-toed shoes, stay out of the water as much as humanly possible, because Tulane University did a water study on some of the puddles in the French Quarter and found 3 unidentified mutated viruses inside the water supply. Yeah, y'all thought the ghosts were bad. So, stay out of the water. Another big thing is when we stop and tell the stories, you guys are going to stay on the sidewalk as close to the edge of the sidewalk to me as possible without standing in the street. 2 reasons. 1, if I get hit by a car and they say they didn't see me, they are lying. Okay? Another big thing is we also want to make sure that we have plenty of room for everybody to cross. You already saw the kind of traffic jam. It's a Saturday. There's going to be a lot of tours out there tonight. We are not the only tour guide company. There are 200 tour guide companies in this city, a lot of haunted tours. And on top of that, if we are caught blockading the sidewalk, it is technically called blockading the pedestrian thoroughfare. It is a $500 fine in the city of New Orleans. You guys do not have that kind of tip money, because if you do, I need to know right now. That's a different tour entirely. I do have a bathroom and bar break on this tour because I do recognize, as someone who just personally experienced it, that you're more likely to see a ghost than a bathroom in this town. So I try to make sure you guys are as equipped for that as possible. For my day drinkers, because I already see a couple of you in hand, as it's 7:30. It is a marathon, not a sprint. Drink water, hydrate, don't dehydrate. Okay? Okay. Glad we got that covered. I've been doing this a long time. So, with that being said, like I said, my name is Moira. I've been a tour guide since 2017, which is 6 years. In a lot of industries, 6 years is not a long time. In this industry, I am ancient. I've been doing this a while, through a lot of stuff. On top of that, I am one of the lead investigators for the New Orleans Paranormal Explorers. If you put those letters together, it spells NOPE. We are the NOPE team. We NOPE identify the haunted locations. We are the dumb white people in the horror story. So very self-aware tour guide. With that being said, other big thing is, I know I'm leaning on this wall. When it's things like this is fine, but please do not lean on the buildings. They are nationally recognized historic properties, which means if you damage them in any way, it is technically a federal offense. Don't do that, right? Don't do that. So, it's just, also, let's be honest, you wouldn't like anybody else leaning up on your house. Don't do it to theirs. That's what I can say about it. Any questions over the not fun stuff? No? Everybody's already slightly terrified about the water thing. We haven't gotten past that. I can see the horror. With that being said, we're going to go over the gruesome, gory, ghostly details of the city of New Orleans. This is my favorite tour to give, by the way. This is my bread and butter. This is what I live, eat, breathe, die on. So I will say, you guys have one of the best tour guides giving one of the best tours in the city. Go you, aren't you so lucky? Hashtag blessed. Listen, I just came off vacation. It's real sassy right now. It is sassy clock. With that being said, where we're standing is Jackson Square, probably one of the most iconic parts of the city of New Orleans, and the most haunted, and kind of where all of the supernatural paranormal activity takes root. See, long before Jackson Square, saxophone players, Cafe Du Monde, people who rev their engines on the street for no reason. Long before all of that, love this. This is going great. Where you guys are standing is actually one of the oldest training grounds in the continental United States. We have had indigenous tribes such as the Choctaw, the Natchez, the Chapatulas, the Homas, and more, congregating in this area of the Mississippi River for 30,000 years. In fact, they nicknamed this area Balbancha, which translates to place of many tongues, for the sheer amount of different tribes that would congregate and do business in this region. Now, while they did trade and commerce, they never settled on this area of the Mississippi River. And in fact, in 1682, when LaSalle, Bienville, and Iberville would make their way here on behalf of the French government to colonize this region, the indigenous people gave them one major warning. Do not settle in the bend of the river, because if the weather and the animals did not kill you, the monsters would. Clearly, the European white people listened. By 1718, we are officially chartered in the city of New Orleans. By 1726, everything we have built and constructed is wiped out in our first major hurricane. Hurricanes are not uncommon for the city of New Orleans. We actually get Category 4 and Category 5 storms about every 15 to 20 years. And the best example I have of that is actually modern day history. Most people are fully aware of Hurricane Katrina, which would make landfall in the city of New Orleans on August 29th of 2005, breaking in the levees, ushering in upwards of 20 feet of floodwater in some neighborhoods, flooding 88% of the New Orleans and killing thousands. On August 29th of 2021, 16 years to the day of Hurricane Katrina and almost the hour, the strongest and most powerful storm to ever hit Louisiana, Hurricane Ida, would make landfall 16 years later. However, that was now 2 years ago, which means the clock has reset and the countdown begins again. By the way, the only reason we did not have the death toll of Katrina is our levees were 30 minutes from breaking out in the Bayou area where I live, but we are still actually dealing with billions of dollars of damage and recovery we are rebuilding from even now. So, 1763, we go from being French to Spanish in a bloody revolution that I will talk about at the end of the tour because it's my favorite ghost story and I do like saving the best for last. By 1788, we are officially Spanish in this town and Catholic with a capital C. And it is Good Friday, and a Spanish officer by the name of Nunez is doing his due diligence as a devout practicing Catholic, lighting his prayer candles going into the Good Friday Mass, when a simple breeze, yay timing, blew his cotton curtains over the open exposed flames of his house, setting his house on fire. Now, he did what he was supposed to do. He ran right here to St. Louis Cathedral and demanded the church ring the bells to warn the city of the up-and-coming disaster, as the church would have been the original emergency broadcasting system. And no one knows why, but the bells never rang, and the city of New Orleans was never warned. And so, 800 buildings, 80% of the city, and 1,200 people would die in the first Great Fire of 1788. By 1794, two boys were playing with matches in literally the exact same house, caught the cotton curtains on fire again, and burned down the remaining 20% of the city of New Orleans with an unestimated death toll. In true New Orleans fashion, only two buildings managed to survive both great fires. It was a bar and a convent, which is all I feel like you need to know about this town. Now, what that means for you guys is no matter what story I tell, no matter what building we stop in front of, no matter where we walk, no matter where you put your feet, you are walking on the desecrated, cremated, unmarked remains of the thousands of colonizers who would burn alive in both great fires. Things for you to think about in your hotel room late at night by yourself in the dark. You're welcome. By the way, if you're staying in the French Quarter, it is haunted. If they tell you it's not, they're lying. Drunk doesn't help. That has stopped nobody in this town. By 1804, we officially become American as part of the Louisiana Purchase, and one of the drastic changes to our culture was actually our judicial branch. Prior to us being American, all of our courthouses, law offices, and judges were held into that building to the left, which is called the Cathedral. And it even once upon a time held our jail, which meant under Spanish rule, you could get arrested, tried, convicted, and serve your sentence all in one building. A for efficiency. Now, occasionally, someone would do something horrific, and it would result in an execution sentence. And when that would happen, they would walk you up the alley between the Cathedral and the church. A priest would meet you at the steps of St. Louis Cathedral, give you your last rites, your final confession, and then they would escort you to the execution area. There, you could be shot by the firing squad, which is the most merciful way to go. You could be hanged in the gallows, which, if tied appropriately, it'll be an instantaneous death as the noose snaps your neck, but done incorrectly, it is up to 20 minutes of slow suffocation. You can also have your body cut apart into 4 pieces and pulled apart by horses, known as drawing and quartering, and my favorite method of execution, known as breaking at the wheel, which is they tie your body to a massive wagon wheel by your wrists and your ankles, and using an intentionally blunt hammer, break every major bone in your body, working your way up to the skull. And if the internal bleeding and the injuries did not kill you, we left you for the rats, the ravens, and the weather to do the rest. And in case you haven't noticed, our rats are rather large. Now, that execution area where thousands of people, guilty or sometimes even innocent, would lose their lives and never see the light of day again, is the beautiful garden right behind me. Everybody now calls this affectionately Jackson Square, and it is now home to azaleas, magnolias, student selfies, as well as weddings. But once upon a time, this is where many people would draw their last breath and never see another day again. What this means, as you may have noticed, is the gates are completely locked. It is now nightfall in the city of New Orleans, and once the sun begins setting, it is per city law. Nobody is allowed inside Jackson Square as the sun sets unless they have special permitting or things like filming, which obviously today is not the case. And at the end of the tour, I'm going to release you guys very similar to where we started, and you're going to go out and do whatever you plan to do this evening. Go back to your hotel room, go to dinner, go to Bourbon Street, not remember a single thing I told you this evening. I'm not here to judge. Little judgy. Regardless, if you walk past Jackson Square though and you notice that someone's taking a little midnight stroll through our flowers, understand it is a very good chance that who you're looking at is not a living person at all. With that being said, we're going to go ahead and get started.
Kasi pag ano, hindi nakakakuha yung hindi siya buo putol. Kasi di ba naka-wide screen ito. Kaya, yun ako. Tsaka pwede ko naman edit yun. Alright guys, so the next building we're going to talk about is this restaurant right here. This is Muriel's, a fine dining restaurant here in the city of New Orleans. Also one of my top 10 favorite restaurants in the city. This is a cheesecake loving body. I will tell you where's good to eat. I am not going to steer you wrong about food, I promise. I walk so I can. Real quick though, if you ask me what's good in New Orleans, yes. So, we don't do bad food, not a thing. But before it was a restaurant, this was some mansion, a single-family residence owned by a gentleman of the name of Pierre-Antoine Jourdan, very wealthy businessman and real estate agent in the city of New Orleans. And when you're part of our wealthy upper elite, we have certain expectations of you. We expect you to be philanthropic, we expect you to be charitable, we expect you to be sociable, and most importantly, we expect you to throw a damn good party because we've been partying for 300 years and we are not about to stop that anytime soon. And Monsieur Jourdan is an avid party thrower and party goer who loves just a little bit. All right. And of course, he serves some of the best food, best wine, and more. And he has a little bit of an extracurricular activity that's unusual for the time period, which is card gambling. A little bit frowned upon in such a heavily Catholic town, but I guess if you're willing to tithe your winnings every week, God is willing to overlook a few things. Loophole. Now, it is said in an evening in 1811, once again, Monsieur Jourdan is hosting yet another extravagant banquet inside of his house. And the food is served, and the wine is poured, and the music is playing, and the card tables break out. And he sits down to play, and after several rounds and several hours, he has lost several $1,000s. He has lost his wife's heirloom jewelry, and he's even managed to lose a prize racing horse, which for the social and cultural time period is a little bit unacceptable. But he believes the cards in his hand are going to change his fate. He believes this so much so that he goes upstairs to this room right here, which is his original office, goes to his desk, unlocks the secret compartment inside, grabs the deed to his beloved custom-built mansion, and places the deed to the property on the betting table. And the cards fall, and Monsieur Jourdan's luck does change. For the absolute worst. He now loses everything. The new owners give him 72 hours, 3 days, to relocate his wife and children and vacate the property. And he does manage to move his wife and 3 children to a townhome in the frenchquarter, and then at the end of that 72 hours, he grabbed a bottle of fine French vintage wine, uncorked it, down the entire content, walked to the edge of the balcony where that doorway is, and then calmly hung himself over the front door so he never had to leave the house. Dramatic. Now fast forward about 200 years, and roughly around 2003, Muriel's buys the place and becomes the fine dining restaurant we know and love today. And they renovate it, open their doors, and the reviews pour in. And the reviews are all bad. Negative, 1 and 2 stars, which was unusual because when you read the reviews, they said that the food was fantastic, the wine selection was superb, the staff was incredibly welcoming, but everybody was leaving bad reviews because they said the restaurant was dangerous. They said that the bottles and glasses were shattering behind the bars,
Tables and chairs were flying across the dining room. Portraits and paintings were falling on patrons. Tray tables are being knocked out of servers' hands. People are having their hair pulled. They're being shoved. They're being locked in bathrooms. Things being thrown around the kitchen. Whatever is in here is clearly powerful, aggressive, and borderline malicious. So when confronted with such supernatural activity, the owners of Muriel did what everybody in New Orleans would do. They shut down the restaurant, they gave their staff some paid time off, and then they conducted a seance to see what in the world was going on. Hard for the course for New Orleans. And in fact, the area that you just watched them walk out of, that's the seance bar, in honor of the very first seance that was conducted. Now they sit down, the psychic medium opens the session, and is almost immediately able to get answers. So they begin asking the spirits questions. The very first one, who's haunting the place? The answer was Monsieur Pierre-Antoine Jourdain, which confused the owner, custom built this property. He picked the architect, he signed off on all the features, he raised his children in this house, he loved this place. So then why was he so angry? The psychic medium said she had the answer to that as well. That every night we were hosting all of these extravagant dinners and banquets and parties. We're celebrating anniversaries and graduations and reunions and more. We're eating and drinking and laughing and talking and dancing in his house. And no one had bothered to invite him to the party. And that's just rude, especially on this side. So they asked what they could do to alleviate the activity. And the group's going to pass in just a moment. We're going to go exactly where they are. That is the carriageway. And the very back behind the velvet rope is Monsieur Jourdain's table. Every single night they set it for the ghost host of New Orleans, complete with linen, silverware, water, wine glasses, even bread service. It's a privately reserved table, so you do have the option to reserve it yourself. But it does not matter if you reserve it for 4 or 14. They will always set it for one extra person to join. With that being said, I'm going to invite Liz. We're going to walk safely. So the velvet rope in the back.
Wow. Complete with bread service. Wow. That's very cool.
It got amazing pretty. Alright guys, so the next building that we're going to talk about is this one right here on the corner. This is Ursuline Convent, built in 1727. That is one of the oldest buildings inside the city of New Orleans as well as the Mississippi River Delta. It is the convent that survived both great fires. And in order to talk about why we needed a convent in the first place, we get to talk more about the sketchy history that is New Orleans. See, the indigenous people had every right to warn us about the weather and the animals killing you. You guys can already feel this lovely hot humid. We are subtropical climate, so we are the perfect breeding ground for all sorts of diseases: typhoid, dysentery, cholera, yellow fever, scarlet fever, smallpox, chickenpox, Ebola. I think I said malaria, influenza, tuberculosis. Basically, if you could die on it in the Oregon Trail video game, you can and will die of it here. On top of that, we are the perfect epicenter for hurricanes. I did mention that earlier. We also get tornadoes. Had an F3 in a tornado in January. That was super fun. Love that for us. And we also get flash flooding, hail, lightning storms, things of that nature. We also have 5 different venomous snakes, 4 different venomous spiders, 2 breeds of the large cats are native to this area. Black bears are native to this region. And on top of that, alligators. And most of y'all are like, oh, but alligators, cute, snappy snap. Understand, alligators get on average 17 to 18 feet, which is 2 car lengths. And they run 45 miles an hour, and you guys are very slow in crunching. Super. So the life expectancy of the new colony of New Orleans was 11 months. That is how long we expected you to survive in this town, which is to say, not. And of course, nobody's exactly volunteering to come to this swamp-infested hellhole. And so, since they couldn't get volunteers, they need a large body, group of bodies, people, to populate this town. And the easiest way to get a large group of people to come here, even kind of unwillingly, empty out the prisons. And that is exactly what France did. And it did not matter what crime you had committed. Murder, arson, rape, pedophilia, kidnapping, political dissonance, talking against the king, does not matter. Whatever crime you had committed, you come to New Orleans, you are now free and clear, clean slate, new man. And a couple years go by and we check in, and it's a 90% male population, which is real bad math if you need to make the baby do to make the population grow. So now they need women to come to New Orleans. And the women don't volunteer. Can't imagine why. So they do Penal Colony Part 2 Electric Boogaloo, and they empty out the female prisons, and they ship all the women over here, and most of those women had been put in jail for prostitution. And so when they got to New Orleans, they realized there were 9 dudes for every 1 woman, and mama likes money. And so some of our very first establishments were brothels and bordellos and bars. And so anytime you guys, let's get this out of the way now, ask me if New Orleans is safe. No, it never has been. For 300 years, we are a city founded by pirates, prostitutes, and prisoners. Nothing has changed. Our criminals nowadays just sit in office and make the laws. I wish that was a joke. So, no, it's not safe. Get that out of your head right now. At this point, the French government realizes they may have messed this up just a little bit. So the Catholic Church intervenes and they step in and they decide they're going to start a new repopulation program, handpicking brides to come to New Orleans. It's an arranged marriage program to basically create a more aristocratic culture. Now, before the ladies on my tour were like, why would anybody sign up? Understand, this is the early 1700s in France.
Women are not allowed to inherit. We are not allowed to go to school. We are not allowed to own property. We are not allowed to make money. We are not allowed to hold office. We have no rights at all to speak of. No inheritance at all comes to us. If we are lucky, we are born pretty and fertile, and not everybody's that lucky. So, basically what the Archdiocese tells these young women is if they agree to become a new bride in the new world, they will pay for their passage here. They will give them a dowry. They will give them all the supplies that they need to start a new life. When they get to New Orleans, they are guaranteed protection. They are guaranteed a place to live. They are guaranteed an education. They are guaranteed health care. And they are guaranteed a marriage to a wealthy man with land in this town. Right? Like a couple guys I'm on tour, like, I'm wearing a dress. Where are we going? I'm pretty. Let's go. So, like, it starts sounding like a pretty good idea. And so these young women are called the casquette girls, Casquette. It is French for the word trunk because of the government-issued trunk these girls were given. And these are all unaccompanied, unmarried young women. And so to protect their virtue, among other things, they need somewhere safe to go. And what's going to be one of the safest places to keep a young unmarried woman? Convent. Now, these casquette girls arrived in 1729. 900 young women come to the city of New Orleans. And the minute they get here, the rumors swirl because people believe something else came to the city of New Orleans with them. They noticed something a little unusual about the arrival of the new brides into the new world. First, is all of these young women arrive under the cover of darkness and by the secrecy and armed protection of the Catholic Church. Second, when they finally laid their eyes on the young women, they were described as being nothing more than walking corpses. Their bodies malnourished and thin, skeletal in nature, skin so pale it was practically transparent, hair scraggly and stringy, nails so long they were almost like claws, and they said that they were blistered within 5 minutes of exposure to the Louisiana sun. And right after the girls arrived, a bunch of men in New Orleans went missing at a very rapid rate. Their bodies were oftentimes found floating in the Mississippi River, their throats ripped out, their bodies torn apart, almost as if they had been attacked by a vicious wild animal. But the reports also said that no blood was ever found in the bodies, and no blood was ever found on the clothing. And so they believed monsters arrived in the city of New Orleans, and that monster had a very specific name. Anybody want to take a guess of what it was?
Vampire.
Good job, class. Now, when I say vampires and you say vampires, let's be real honest real quick. Every one of you has a favorite. Don't lie to me. Do not tell me who it is. That is between you and God. I don't need to know. One of y'all tried to say it. No, I don't need to know. The second major thing is most of the vampires that we now picture, regardless of who your favorite is, let's be frank, are sexy. They're half-dressed, very attractive, awesome soundtrack in the background, 2 teeth talking about forever and eternal youth, all of those shenanigans. You're all laughing because you all know that's why we have now grown to love vampires and these conflicted eternal creatures of the night, right? And that is all Hollywood. That is cinema to blame for all of this concept of basically sexy vampires. The vampires of old are far more dangerous and far more terrifying. They're called the Nosferatu. They are described as being walking corpses, skeletal, basically just skin stretched over bones. Their skin is nothing more than leather and translucent. You can see the blood vessels and veins underneath it. Sharp, long-pointed bat-like ears, dagger-like nails for claws, black voids for eyes, and most importantly, not 2 teeth and some sexy saxophone music when they feed. Oh no. They are described as having a row full of shark-like teeth. And the way that they feed is they kidnap their victims out of the darkness, they pull back their head, they rip out their throat, drink from them like a human Pez dispenser before dumping their body in the trash because that is all we are to them. We are nothing more than cattle. We are food and then garbage. There is no turning. There is no eternal love. There is no coven. There is nothing of that nature. It is destruction and then death. And that was what they worried arrived inside of New Orleans. On top of that, 3 of the young women inside the convent were known for acting rather strangely. They never did any of the classwork during the day, only doing their schoolwork in the dark recesses of the attic at night. They were never seen eating with any of the other young women in the dining hall. When these chaperones, these nuns, would do bed checks, the girls were often missing during the middle of the night. And when they finally would do laundry, they noticed that all of their clothing and bedding was covered with all these strange stains and splatters. No one understood where they were coming from. Now, one of the nuns believes this is a whole bunch of superstitious nonsense. There's no way the Catholic Church would allow vampires into the New World. So she takes it upon herself to do her due diligence and goes to the attic, which is those gray shutters, where all of the trunks, the casquettes, have been stored. And she begins opening the trunks. And they all contain what you expected: clothing, bedding, rosaries, seeds, everything a young woman needs to start a new life in the New World. But 3 of those casquettes, those trunks, the same 3 trunks that belonged to the same 3 very bizarre young women, were filled all the way to the top with dirt that had been brought from France. Because old European vampire lore also states, in order for a vampire to travel across large bodies of water, like the Atlantic Ocean, it has to bring with it the dirt in which it was created in. And in fact, Bram Stoker himself writes about this in Dracula. That is how iconic and knowledgeable we know of this. At which point, the nun panics. Maybe they had accidentally brought monsters to the New World. Maybe they were responsible for the death of dozens of innocent young men. Maybe they had unleashed something to stalk the streets of the French Quarter. So she wrote to the archdiocese, who legend says sent out an archbishop to chain those shutters closed with silver chains that had been blessed by the Pope himself, and then nail those shutters closed with nails that had been dipped in holy water. And it makes you wonder, why would the Catholic Church have things like that on standby, ready to be used so easily? On top of that, the nun took it upon herself to protect the rest of the innocent young women inside of the convent. And so as night fell in the city of New Orleans, she would grab her Bible and her rosaries and ascend the rickety stairs into the attic, putting herself in one of the dark corners. And as darkness crept throughout the city, she began to pray. And for hours, the only thing that stirred in that convent was the whispers of her Hail Marys and her prayers, and the saying of her Latin chants in order to protect the young sleeping women below her. And the hours crept on, and the silence continued, and nothing happened. And eventually, a new day will have to dawn in the city of New Orleans. The sun will begin to rise, and the first few streaks of daylight will make their way across the sky. And just when it seems like safety and security was well within reach, it was then said the convent heard a strange scratching sound echoing through the building, almost as if something was climbing up the impossibly smooth stucco walls. Then the shutters blew open with hurricane force-like wind, and 3 sets of dagger-like claws crawled their way over the dormer windows. Those 3 young women entered into the attic. They laid their eyes on their nun. They ripped out her throat, grabbed their trunks, and disappeared into the French Quarter, where many people claim they still are out today. Now, one of the most key pieces of the story that I left until the very end is all of those young women, all 900, were between the ages of 11 to 17, marriageable age. So imagine that bloodthirsty, cold-hearted apex predator, that killer that we know to be a vampire, and put that in the young, nubile, innocent, naive-looking body of a teenage girl. And it makes you wonder, how hard did Anne Rice really have to think when she wrote characters like Claudia? Now, when I started as a tour guide in New Orleans, there were 3 rules I was told to follow. First was, try not to walk the French Quarter by yourself at night. Honestly, that's a really good rule of thumb. No matter what city you're in, every urban environment has violent crime and criminal activity. Every place has the potential to be dangerous. New Orleans is just real good at it. We're number 1. Go team. Second major rule in this town is a hustler, which means do not take the beads, do not take the hats, do not take the CDs, do not take the flyers. And if anybody asks you where you got your shoes, they are on your feet. Save that money for something else. And then the last thing that I was told was, especially at night, when I was down here giving tours in front of the convent, and I happened to look up, and if I saw that those gray shutters were open, that meant that the vampire children were out hunting, and nobody would be down here to save you. With that being said, we're moving on. We went real far. Alright guys, so my next story is probably the more horrifying of all of it because it's true crime. You don't have to believe in ghosts, you don't have to believe in vampires, but sometimes the real monsters are the very people that are occupying our city. Behind me in the window is the haunted hotel. So first and foremost, it's haunted. I told you they're all haunted. I'm very serious. These guys are just honest and use it in their marketing. And in the window of the haunted hotel, there is a poster. And it's a replica of one of the most interesting pieces of literature that was ever printed
of note that was supposedly written by one of our most prolific unsolved serial killers. Now, so for my true crime serial killer fans, you may be aware of this story. Most people aren't, though. In the fall of 1917, the city of New Orleans is gripped in fear as they wake up to find their friends, their families, their loved ones, their employees, employers, and more slaughtered across the city. Now, while this serial killer does develop a pattern of the way he is killing, the victimology has no pattern. Genders doesn't matter. Male and female are both found dead. Ages does not matter. Oldest victim is 68, the youngest is 2, a toddler asleep on its mother's chest. Neighborhoods doesn't matter. People are being found dead here in the French Quarter, in the Marigny, in Uptown, across the river in Gretna. So whoever this is prowling literally across New Orleans and beyond. And on top of that, ethnicities did not matter. Italian, Irish, African American, German, literally everybody is fair game. Now, what does start to develop is a pattern of the way this person is killing. They become known as the Axeman murder of New Orleans. Not only do we know that they were killed because of the injuries sustained, being bludgeoned in the head and torso by an axe, but weirdly enough, the axe was always left at the scene of the crime. The axe belonged to the family of the victims themselves. Understand that's not weird for the time period. This is 1917. This is before electricity, central heating, and things of that nature. So you would have had to have an axe to chop firewood, to light your home, to cook. And on top of that, a lot of our historic homes like this, we still have axes inside of our property in case of flash flooding. It allows us an immediate exit, so that way we literally don't drown in our homes. Having an axe, not weird. But the axe being left behind intentionally means that the serial killer is not taking it to hide evidence, so they're not trying to hide that they're killing these people. They're not taking it for a trophy, so that's a little unusual as well. What's also unusual is nobody knows the motive. Robbery doesn't seem to be it. There were several homes that were left with cash right out in the open, jewelry boxes untouched, valuables left alone. There was no mutilation to any of the corpses, nothing ritualistic or sexual in nature. Nobody knows why they're killing. They seem to only be killing between the hours of 4 a.m. to 6 a.m., so a very, very small window. And what's even more bizarre is nobody knows how the serial killer is getting in. All of the homes were discovered with the doors and windows locked in the inside by the victims themselves. So, not only do we not know who it is, we don't know why, we don't know how, we barely even know when, and we barely know what. By the spring of 1918, 12 people would die at the hands of the Axeman murderer, 6 would survive, and the few survivors were of no help to the investigation. Whoever this killer was always smart enough to attack in the eyes and the face first, blinding their victims, rendering any testimony useless because they could not give an age, they could not give a height, a weight, they could not give an ethnicity, they could not give a gender. We assume and frequently say he or use male pronouns because over for a time with forensic profiling and criminal psychology, we have discovered that it does tend to be men doing violent crimes with murder weapons. Women tend to do a more prolonged style of killing, such as poisoning, which is why we get away with more. Something I remind my husband about frequently. But we actually don't know that the serial killer wasn't female to begin with. And then on top of that, by the spring of 1918, they are at least able to read and write, which is also unusual, and they send a letter to the Times-Picayune newspaper, who then prints it, and that's what's in the window. They not only admitted to being the person killing all of the people in New Orleans, was happy about killing, basically called themselves a demon sent from hell to stalk the streets of the city, said that they would continue killing, mocked the New Orleans Police Department for being inept, understaffed, and unable to solve crimes. Thank you. It's on Amazon.
Oh, fantastic.
Bing, bing, that person. Google wide brim straw hat. You'll get it. Okay. Anyways. And then they said they would keep killing unless anybody who played jazz music would be spared the literal axe. Now, in 2023, you hear jazz and you go, yeah, New Orleans makes sense. Didn't make sense in 1918. You have to understand, in 1918, jazz is working on being outlawed, not only in the city of New Orleans, but throughout the state of Louisiana and most of the South. Why? It is predominantly played by African-American male musicians. It got its start in the legalized brothels and bordellos in New Orleans, so it's no better than whorehouse music. And because it encouraged the integration of races and genders and social classes, we can't have blacks and whites, women and men, rich and poor, integrating inside the Jim Crow-era South. Now can we? So what this letter is saying, especially to the white, wealthy, upper elite in town, is you have to allow black men into your home to play the whorehouse music or die. That's a hell of an ultimatum, right? But they listen.
And anybody who could afford to hire a musician would do so, putting them in the doors and the windows and the balconies and the parlors, opening it up for everybody to listen to. If you couldn't hire a musician, the bodies crammed inside of the dance halls and the concert venues, anywhere and everywhere jazz could be found. And they reported that jazz music echoed out of every door, of every window, of every home, around every corner, throughout every street and every neighborhood, playing non-stop for hours. And when the sun finally rose and the music finally stopped, the Times-Picayune newspaper reported that no one died at the hands of the Axeman murderer. He never struck. And in fact, local crime beats even said that nobody died at all, even of natural causes or accidents, which even in 2023 is almost impossible, a miracle in and of itself. And just like he promised, the Axeman murderer of New Orleans disappeared, never to take another life or shed another drop of blood in this city ever again. We are actually closer to figuring out who Jack the Ripper is than we are the Axeman murderer of New Orleans. Nowadays, jazz is synonymous with this city because we did give birth to some of the greatest jazz legends of all time. Louis Prima, King Oliver, Sidney Bechet, Jelly Roll Morton, Buddy Bolden, Louis Armstrong, and more. You're welcome. But one of the reasons we love jazz so much One of the reasons we love jazz so much in this town is because for us, it literally saved and spared our lives. And with that being said, we're going to everybody's favorite stop, the bar break. Alright guys, so the next building that we're going to talk about is this very sketchy looking structure. This is the third oldest building in the city of New Orleans. For those who went to Jean Lafitte's blacksmith shop, which I see a couple of y'all did, you went to one of the oldest buildings, that was the bar. Madame John's Legacy is what this is called. Did burn down in the 1788 in the first Great Fire, but it survived the second Great Fire. If you're like, why does it look so rough? This is what Hurricane Ida does to historic properties. So she is undergoing an $8 million renovation. Please bear with her. I doubt you would be looking good mid-procedure as well. Now, she also has a little bit of a movie claim to fame. How many of you saw Interview with the Vampire with Brad Pitt and Tom Cruise? Almost everybody. Awesome. Fantastic. So click back into your movie trivia brain. If you remember the scene where Kirsten Dunst is playing the piano and he tells her, "That's perfect, young lady, now play something somber," and then they eat everyone? Ta-da, the home they eat everyone in. So when they're bringing the coffins down the stairs and such, ta-da, Madame John's Legacy. Now, prior to her being known as a film set and things of that nature, what she was originally our Yellow Fever Museum, and that is actually what we're here to talk about is Yellow Fever, because Yellow Fever actually gives birth to one of our favorite horror genres. We have successfully talked about vampires, ghosts, serial killers, politics, and so now one of our next favorite horror genres is going to be zombies. In order to talk more about zombies, though, we need to talk more about the disease. Yellow fever is a mosquito-borne illness, and mosquitoes thrive in hot, humid environments. Wow. Yeah. Ta-da! And it is an 80% mortality rate, meaning 8 out of 10 people who contract yellow fever will die. So in this group, about 3 of y'all are making it. Figure it out, Hunger Games. I got my bets on some of y'all. But in order for you to survive that disease, you have to go through all of the symptoms of the disease regardless. This includes the high spiking fever that it's named after, 104 to 105 degree Fahrenheit temperatures over the course of several days, sometimes even lasting into weeks, which does result in brain damage. It also causes severe dehydration and causes your kidneys and your liver to shut down, which results in jaundiced skin, the yellow part of yellow fever. Frequently, because this is a blood-borne illness, you'll also actually have a thinning of your platelets and blood cells, and you'll bleed from your eyes, your ears, your nose, your mouth, other mucous membranes and orifices. You can figure out what that word means. And oftentimes that blood is ingested, it's swallowed, and when it hits the sulfuric acid of your stomach, it congeals into this gross, sticky, black-like bile. And then when you vomit it back up, it's almost like coffee grounds that get stuck in your esophagus and coats your face and throat. Then what will end up happening is you'll slip into a coma, which your respiratory and circulatory systems will begin to fail, which causes shallow breathing, a plummeting blood pressure, a drop in your pulse, before 8 out of 10 of you are not waking up on the other side of that coma, okay? So, what would happen is people frequently died inside of the homes, and we would conduct funerals inside of the home, because the funeral industry does not become the industry that we really know of today until about the 1920s, 1930s with embalming and mass industrialization. So it was not uncommon to have a funeral and a wake inside of the property. And so what would happen is you would bring the body down from the front, from the bedroom where they passed away in. You'd bring them down to the front parlor. You would lay them out to rest, and that is where you would conduct the wake and any of the other funeral ceremony procedures. And that means that sometimes we would make mistakes and we would declare somebody dead that had not died from the disease. We really only had one method at the time for declaring somebody dead, and what we would do is we would take a silverback mirror, we would place it underneath their nose, and we would wait for the breath to fog up the mirror, which is kind of a problem when one of the symptoms is shallow breathing. So we have Aunt Agnes, we put the nose underneath, or mirror underneath the nose, and Agnes doesn't breathe on it. Oh no, Aunt Agnes has died from yellow fever. And we'll bring her and we'll put her in this front parlor, and we'll get ready for the funeral. And in fact, so many surviving family members are gathering in this front parlor, and so many funerals are taking place, that this front parlor soon gets the nickname of the living room. So where you guys binge watch Hulu and TV, and you play your video games and watch Bridgerton, ladies, I know who you are. That's actually where your ancestors got to watch the dead and decomposing bodies of their loved ones. Things for you to think about late at night by yourself in your house in the dark. You're welcome. It's the cats, I swear. And occasionally we'd make mistakes, and Aunt Agnes would be in the living room, and let's say we wandered off and we're grabbing a glass of water, or maybe we're grabbing a vase for the funeral, and we come back and Aunt Agnes just up walking around the living room because she'd survived yellow fever. But she's got that brownish yellow skin from the jaundice. She's got the dried blood around her eyes and her nose, the black, gross like bile around her mouth and her chin. She's got the basically very dehydrated skin. She's moaning and groaning and shuffling from the brain damage. And she doesn't have a pulse or a breath that we saw. And guess what that looks a whole lot like? Zombies, Walking Dead. And in fact, the original iteration of the word zombie, Z-O-M-B-I, is actually from Haiti. It is from the Caribbean and has been found in documentation since the 1700s. And it does mean to resurrect or reawaken. That is how often and how common we are used to this word. Now, that's all fine and dandy, and we can call Aunt Agnes the Walking Dead and a zombie when she dies in the house. But New Orleans would succumb to 67 disease epidemics that would result in thousands of deaths. And in 1853 alone, 10,000 people died of yellow fever in 3 weeks.
Wow.
10% of our population is wiped out in a month, and we could not keep up with the amount of bodies and funerals. So we were not hosting the funerals in the homes. We now had to resort to body piles, 7 to 8 people high, and they stretched from the edge of the river to the edge of the basin, which is 9 city blocks of dead bodies. And that means we made mistakes there too. Sometimes people have been declared dead who had not died from yellow fever, and they'd be thrown onto the body pile. And if they were real lucky, they'd wake up at the top of the body pile with a severe case of PTSD. But at least an immunity to yellow fever, so they've got that going for them. If they were unlucky, which so many often were, they were found at the middle or the bottom of the body pile. They would die of things like compartmentalization syndrome, which what that is the compression of your extremities. Your blood cannot circulate properly, does not receive the proper oxygen, and it becomes septic inside of your own arteries and veins. And the minute that septic blood is released for any reason, because the pressure is removed, like moving a body, It re-enters your circulatory system and essentially poisons you from the inside. You can also slowly be crushed to death from the weight of the bodies above you that are breaking your ribs, puncturing your lungs, compressing your chest cavity, and eventually slowly suffocating you. And then there's my favorite way for you to go. This is a summer disease, meaning an ambient temperature of 97 to 98 degrees outside with a humidity of 80 to 90%, meaning on average our heat index will easily climb. Our heat index will climb to 100. They're moving on. Yay. On average, our heat index climbs to 110, 115 degrees Fahrenheit normal. Add the additional heat and humidity of all of those bodies stacked on top of themselves, and the bodies will essentially liquefy in the decomposition process. So what actually happened for most people is they would drown on the rotting, liquefied bodily fluids of all the corpses melting above them. Things for you to think about later when you want gumbo. My favorite part of the tour, I'm a terrible person. So, also understand that we did not discover the cure to yellow fever until 1905. We did not officially eradicate the disease until the 1920s. And in 2022, last summer, we received 3 positive cases of yellow fever inside of Orleans Parish. So, that means our disease epidemics are never too far behind. And when you guys ask me if it's haunted, the answer will always be yes. Because much like the fires, there is just a lot of mass death. Every single one of these properties has experienced trauma and tragedy. Every single one of these houses has seen death. And it is not hard to believe that many of the people who would take their last breath inside of these buildings never actually left them. Any questions real quick, guys? All right, with that being said, once this group walks past, I have one last story.
Does it look like a cave?
Holding up the front because this building is about to fly.
When they got here, they realized they were gone. Doors was a bunch of shacks, in the middle of swamp on it. Frenchquarter was our car calling you. Yep.
You ever want proof God was drunk? It was June. Alright guys, last story for you guys takes place here on the back of the cathedral in one of the oldest parts of the city of New Orleans. So we were pretty close to where we started. And we go back in time, because like I said, I saved the best for last, and I do.
And this goes all the way back to 1763. In 1763, France and Spain were fighting the 7 Years' War over in Europe, and France loses. And so, therefore, they have to sign over all of their colonies and strongholds to Spain. So while we in New Orleans, or Nouvelle Orleans, were working diligently to become a new little Paris, this means that we woke up one morning and it is now Viva España! And we hate it. We want nothing to do with the Spanish crown. And in fact, the very first Spanish governor, Governor Muriel, we chased all the way to Havana, Cuba, because we were that serious about the no habla español part of this equation. We spent 6 years rioting, revolting, and there was another word and I completely forgot it, but that's okay. Rioting and revolting against the Spanish crown. And by 1769, King Carlos is more than tired of our shenanigans. So he sends an enterprising Spanish-Irish immigrant that is now a general in his army, a man by the name of, I kid you not, this is on the tour guide's test, we are that serious about it, and it's in the history books. His name is Alejandro O'Reilly. Would not make that up if I wanted to. And he becomes the new governor of New Orleans. The minute that O'Reilly lands here in the city of New Orleans, he becomes known as Bloody O'Reilly for the sheer amount of raiding, pillaging, and problems he causes out in the Bayou country. Now, when he gets to New Orleans proper, he realizes something about New Orleans. Actually, realizes two things about New Orleans. The first is we are real scrappy. We will fight anything. Hands are rated E for everyone. Let's go. Not afraid to pick a fight. Win them. Subject to interpretation, but pick them. Let's go. Second major thing about New Orleans, he realizes we're real cool with dying. In case you haven't noticed, throughout this entire tour, we have been dying a lot in a wide variety of very colorful ways. We're real cool with death. As long as we get to die French, that's all that matters. And O'Reilly realizes if he murders everybody in the colony, that kind of defeats the purpose of why the king sent him. So he decides to change tactics. And what he does is he tells all of the financial backers, the political figureheads, the leaders of this rebellion, that they're going to compromise about how the city of New Orleans is going to move forward, and they're going to negotiate on how the city is to be run. And those negotiations are going to be held at the U.S., what is now the U.S. Mint and Jazz Museum. It is the original Spanish barracks, that is the original building, and why it is called Barracks Street. And it was a finely catered event of Spanish food and Spanish wine on Spanish plates with Spanish linens and Spanish music. The whole point is Spain's got money. I told you two mugs are dumb. It's good to be Spanish, and everybody should just quietly and calmly come underneath Spanish rule, right? And the food is served, and the food is cleared, and the wine is poured, and the wine is cleared, and eventually the peace talks are supposed to begin. And so Alejandro O'Reilly stands at the head of the table, and his very first order of business to open up these negotiations is he executes every man sitting there. Then, to drive his point even further, he drags the bodies along the bank of the river and posts them in the execution area, aka Jackson Square, right across from the cathedral, so that way all of those surviving French families and all of the backers of this rebellion must pass the bloated, bloodied bodies of their loved ones to go to Mass 3 to 5 times a week as a reminder of what should happen should you betray the Spanish crown. Now, clearly, this upsets and traumatizes many people inside the city of New Orleans. And so the head priest at the time, Father Pierre-Antoine Dagobert, took it upon himself to do two major things. The first was he wrote a letter to the Spanish government and petitioned a proper burial for those Frenchmen, said regardless of our clash of cultures, regardless of French versus Spanish, we were all Catholic. We were all children under the eyes of God. These men deserve to have a proper burial and to be laid to rest in peace. And while we waited for that letter and the response, it was also said that Antoine Dagobert would walk along the alleys and through the gardens, hour after hour, singing the Kieries, those Latin prayer songs, his baritone voice with a French accent carrying around the gardens in the neighborhood, in an attempt to bring a sense of peace and serenity to a clearly upset congregation. And weeks went by of praying and singing and waiting. And eventually we would hear back from the Spanish government. And the answer was, absolutely not. Those men had betrayed the Spanish crown, and they would continue to be treated like the animals they chose to behave like. Now, whether by divine providence, coincidence, which is not something I believe in the city of New Orleans, or maybe just Louisiana being her usual chaotic, unpredictable self, not long after we received this letter and refusal of this burial, a massive storm kicked up in the city of New Orleans.
They said the rain was so thick you couldn't see the homes across the street. The wind so strong it howled through the houses, shattering the windows, rattling the doors, making you unable to talk to your own family members. And of course, this is a time before levees, so the Mississippi River will rise and ebb and flow, leave her banks. And when the storm finally cleared, the bodies of the Frenchmen were gone. And when the Spanish investigated, everybody said the bodies must have washed away in the floodwaters. Happens all the time, even now in the city of New Orleans. But what has been passed down from generation to generation of surviving French families, 200 years of family folklore, is what has actually happened is in the midst and the thick of the wind and the rain, that everybody heard a knock on the door. And when they opened it, in the midst of that hellacious weather, stood Father Dagobert. And one by one, he escorted the surviving French families into the chapel, where miraculously the bodies of the Frenchmen had been cured. They had been laid out to rest, and together he led them in prayers, washed and cleansed the bodies, wrapped them in burial shrouds, gave them their last rites and final confessions, and then under the protection of darkness and with only the lamplight of the little lanterns and protection of oilcloths, they waded through the flooded streets of New Orleans, up and over the fortified rampart, and laid those men to rest on the other side. And over on North Rampart Street is the original boundaries for St. Louis No. 1 Cemetery. And it has often been said the reason we chose the location for St. Louis No. 1 Cemetery is in honor of the very first Frenchmen that were buried there. And it is also why we also still call that street Frenchman Street. Now, time moves on, and Pierre-Antoine Dagobert will age, and by 1776, he will die of natural causes. Beloved by all, his funeral takes place here at St. Louis Cathedral, and it takes days as thousands pour in to give their love, their wishes, and their respects to a man who got them through one of the most tumultuous times in New Orleans history. Eventually, his body will be laid to rest where it remains today in the catacombs that are located under the cathedral with over 150 prominent clergymen of the city of New Orleans. And while we know where his body rests in peace, it seems his spirit is not quite finished. See, time and time again, multiple things happen in front of the cathedral. One is it is said as if you stand here in this alley, specifically Antoine's Alley, so named after Antoine Dagobert, especially when it rains, people hear the sound of a Latin voice with a French accent of baritone nature singing those Latin Kyries, those prayer songs in the gardens and among the alley during the raindrops. It's also said a church is a place of refuge, so if you've ever in need of help, find your way to St. Louis Cathedral. You can see it throughout most of the French Quarter, and time again, people have reported a monk coming out, giving them a shoulder to cry on, wiping away the tears from their eyes, giving them a glass of water, even calling emergency services if that is what is needed. But by the time the fire department, the ambulance, the fire trucks, the police show up, the church is dark, it's locked, no phone call has ever been reported, and the only person that's ever on the steps of the cathedral is the victim who needed help. It's also said, never forget that St. Louis Cathedral is still a fully functioning church, and actually we're technically bigger than a cathedral. We're a basilica, one of the only registered Catholic basilicas in the entire country. So if you're just a little too loud and rowdy, especially when Mass is being commenced, a monk has come out of either side of the church or through the gardens and shush people for their inappropriate behavior, for disrupting those prayers and bothering those parishioners. What's interesting about all of that is we have not had a monk in this part of the French Quarter for over 150 years. And with that being said, ladies and gentlemen, that is the end of my tour. Like Lady Gaga, I live for the applause.